Hey, welcome back, everybody, to part two of Genetics and Genesis RH Negative in the Scriptures. I'm Aaron Sampson from Omega Chronicles TV. You can also find me on SITREP2020 on Wednesday nights at 10 p.m. on the Holy Hand Grenade YouTube channel with my co-host Ian Chadrick. It's awesome to be here at Take on the World 2020 and to be a speaker here.
Nestled in the mountains between France and Spain, there is a semi-isolated population of native European people that have long puzzled anthropologists, linguists, and historians because although they are Caucasoid, they do not fit in with the rest of the European population. Their language, for example, is distinctly unique in Europe and not related to any other Indo-European language. But that's not the only thing that's unique about the Basque. The Basque turned out to also be unique in terms of blood. Prior to the advent of genetic research tools, investigators used the ABO blood groups to study the relationships between human populations as well as their migration patterns. Each person's blood is one of four major types: A, B, AB, or O. Blood types are determined by the types of antigens on the blood cells. Antigens are proteins on the surface of blood cells that can cause a response from the immune system. The Rh factor is a type of protein on the surface of red blood cells. Most people are Rh positive. Those who do not have the Rh factor are Rh negative, which compromises about 15% of the world's population, but appears in much higher percentage among the Basque, which as a population contain among the highest levels of Rh negative blood in the world. Exactly who are the Basque and where did they come from? I decided that a great place to find out is the University of Nevada, since it houses the Center for Basque Studies. This organization is primarily a research center that conducts and publishes on Basque-related topics such as anthropology, history, cultural studies, etc. Here's what they had to say about the Basque people and their origins, and this comes from their website's frequently asked questions. Question: where did the Basque come from? No one knows exactly where the Basque come from. Some say they have lived in the area since Cro-Magnon man first roamed Europe. Some say they are descended from the original Iberians. More fanciful theories exist as well. One is that the Basques are the descendants of the survivors of Atlantis. Question: where did the Basque language come from? Just as no one is sure about the origins of the Basques themselves, linguists are not in agreement over the origins of Euskara, the Basque language, either. When asked, I found that the majority of the Basque people themselves maintain that they came from Atlantica, a powerful maritime nation that sank into the Atlantic Ocean after a terrible cataclysm, and from which a few survivors reached the Bay of Biscay and the Pyrenees Mountains. This, they say, is not just mythology, but their true pre-European ancestry. There's another ancient people who claim racial lineage from the mythical Atlanteans. The Berbers are currently located geographically around Mount Atlas, but inhabit much of North Africa long before the Arabs arrived. The Berbers are considered the aboriginals of the area, and their origins beyond that are not officially known. Here we have a population, many of whom have blue eyes and light hair, living in northwest Africa of all places, and amongst some of the blonde tribes still living near the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, the percentage of Rh negative blood can reach 40%. Now keep in mind, that's not the general national average, but restricted to certain local tribes. Anthropologists, for the most part, dismissed them for many years because they didn't fit well with the out-of-Africa paradigm. So it was presumed that they had migrated from somewhere in Europe. However, that theory has been abandoned with the current understanding of genetics. Scientists now accept the genetic evidence that concludes Berbers are an indigenous people, which they believe are descended from native Upper Paleolithic Cro-Magnon types going straight back into the Pleistocene or Ice Age. This should make it easier to understand why the oldest remains found in Egypt, nicknamed Ginger, and currently on display in the British Museum, has naturally red hair. This is pre-dynastic, which means before the pharaohs and before the accepted dating of the pyramids. I can go on for quite some time about blonde and red-headed mummies and blue-eyed statues, but I'll save that for a future video on ancient Egypt. For now, let us turn to another population native to an island off of the African coast who also left mummies and pyramids. The Guanches were very tall, powerfully built, blonde and red-haired indigenous natives of the Canary Islands, specifically the island of Tenerife. To date, there is still no evidence that the Guanches had any knowledge of maritime technology, which begs the question, how did they get there? This isolation allowed the Guanche to maintain a racial exclusivity until the time of the Spanish conquest. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, concerning the ethnic origins and racial identity of the Canary Island Guanches, and I quote, "The Guanches are thought to have been of Cro-Magnon origin, with blue or gray eyes and blondish hair." Madame Blavatsky, foundress of the Theosophical Society, points out that the genetic relations between these three populations, well over 100 years before our modern understanding of DNA, and I quote, she says, "If then the Basque and Cro-Magnon cavemen are of the same race as the Canaries Guanches, it follows that the former are also allied to the Aborigines of America. The Atlantean affinities of the three types becomes patent."
There's a lot of things in that video I wish I could had time to cover over, but I did find it interesting, the women from the Basque culture, how they wore head coverings, and from the Berbers as well, and how they were dressed. It almost reminded me of Jewish ceremonial weddings, of how they were dressed and decked out and had henna on their hands and stuff. I thought it was really cool. But the Basque and the Barber and the Guanchen people of the Canary Islands was something that Madame Blavatsky, 40 or 50 years before they even had any understanding of blood types, was looking into. And if you don't know who Madame Blavatsky is, but she's tied into the Theosophy Society and was influential in the Nazi regime in their occult understanding and ideology of searching after the recreation of the Aryans, which is almost like, when I'm looking at the genetics, is like trying to go back to the beginning, like retrace back to where this was. I've found so many things that are interesting in my studies, and one of them being, we kind of have to throw out our idea of what people groups look like now and saying that they look like that back then, because our history and our genetics show a completely different story. For instance, the country of Iran, if you actually go and look up what the original meaning or name of Iran means, it actually ties back to the Aryan or Aryan, and it's called the Kingdom of the Aryans. That's what Iran means. And if you look at Iran today, the people group there looks completely different. And I'm going to show you some more about this later. But this idea of this genetic division between colors, races, things like that, I think we'll start to piece together when we actually understand our genetics and where we all come from. So the best place to start, where I started looking into this, is the telltale sign of Rh negative is the infertility in women. And so when I started looking this into the Bible, and I started reading through about the genetics, and I would hit this person and this person and this person, and then I started seeing this person was barren, this person was barren, this person was barren. And so I really wanted to start with that and talk about that a little bit, because there's something going on here inside of the genetics where there are these particular patriarchs and matriarchs that it's like they're the only ones that could do this at this particular time. But let's start with the barrenness in the Bible. This is a little slide here I have for you. Female Ha-Adam lineage, Rh negative incompatibility and barrenness. So you'll probably recognize some of these names, but each one of them has a biblical scripture that represents them as being barren at some point or another. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Sampson's mother, who unfortunately was unnamed, Samuel's mother, Hannah, and Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother. The Bible presents all forms of fertility as gifts from God. Pregnancy occurs when Yahweh remembers women and opens up their wombs. Biblically, women who experience a period of barrenness often understood their inability to conceive as divine withholding of blessing, a punishment, or even a curse. Sarah understood her barrenness to be a result of God withholding the gifts of pregnancy. It says, Yahweh was preventing me from bearing children. It's Genesis 6:2. Later, during Sarah's strange sojourn into the house of King Abimelech, Yahweh is said to have closed fast all the wombs of the house of Abimelech as punishment for Abimelech taking Sarah into his house. That's Genesis 20:18. Michael, the daughter of Saul and wife of King David, offended David when she rebuked him for dancing naked before the ark of Yahweh. When the narrator closes Michal's story with the notification that Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death, a reader could conclude that her barrenness is divine punishment or a curse. In concluding that her barrenness is divine punishment or a curse, that I'm still not 100% sure about, but we'll keep on going here. Hosea is another one. He announces that days of punishment have come, such that Yahweh will guarantee that Ephraim as a nation experiences no birth, no pregnancy, or no conception. It's Hosea 9:7 and Hosea 11. A notification of woman's barrenness can also serve as a harbinger of a miraculous birth of a divinely chosen male leader. The foundational mothers of ancient Israel, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, were all described as barren, and each became pregnant through divine intervention. In the Rachel and Leah saga, the narrator tells us that when Yahweh saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Genesis 29:31. He later remembers Rachel and opens her womb, allowing her to conceive and bear a son, Joseph. That's Genesis 30:22 through 24. The sons of once barren matriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, became the chosen sons in their father's houses and the foundational ancestors of the nation of Israel. We also find barrenness as a theme in the stories of the unnamed mother of Sampson, and Hannah, the mother of Samuel, and Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. The son born to these women were singled out as special. They were Nazarites, priests, or heralds of the future Messiah. In each of these stories, barrenness served as literary and theological purpose, heightening the tension around the divine promise of these children and their ordained leadership. So I find it interesting that, I went to search for the barrenness and I found it, and that's the telltale sign. So that is like my kickboard, my starting point where I found that. I was going to say, if this wasn't in here and it wasn't more than a couple of cases, then we'll just throw it out. But what I found was all of these people were barren. And so then I said, well, where do I go from here? So I had to go all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to Genesis. And I had to start looking for this genetic line. And that's the best way that I can tell you guys to go do this. And we're going to start off with a little bit of a different perspective, like we talked about earlier, on how to look at Genesis. And I'm going to give you guys a different view to start this so that we can understand where both of these bloodlines come from. And we'll start with Adam. And I do have to preface this by saying, when you're looking at the stories of Adam and the lineage going down, we have to be kind of open-minded and understand that the things that we don't understand doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. I've seen a lot of people, when they come to different things, if you don't have the openness or the keys to unlock to understand them, then you just kind of throw it by the wayside. So we want to look at this with a different understanding and come to the realization that there's possibilities for things in the scriptures that we're not sure or aware of. Because what I see is a lot of people, they get caught up in the inconsistencies and not realize, the Bible doesn't have contradictions. The contradictions are in our understanding. And so that's where I kind of want to push forward to with this. So the next part, we're going to talk about Adam in Genesis 1:27 and Adam in Genesis 2:7. Now I want you to, as I read through these, kind of understand the differences between them. So God created mankind, Adam, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Genesis 1:27. Now, if you look at the right below that, that is Adam in the Hebrew and how we would say it and pronounce it today. On the next one below is, then Yahuwah formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And that man became a living being. Genesis 2:7. So this is a little bit interesting because when you look at the Hebrew, it's different. It's Ha-Adam. And if you look at actually how it's spelled, there's a he, or an added letter into it. Now we have to look at the author of all of Genesis to kind of understand how this works. So for those that don't know, Moses was the author of most of the Torah up until his death. So when Moses writes something later on in the script, he was meaning the same thing he was writing on in the beginning. And we kind of look at what's called the first use in biblical study. So we have to go and find when it was first used, and then that's applied later on. Well, we can do that this way as well because we're looking at the entire writing of Moses. Now, Moses didn't change his literary writing style and start introducing stuff later on to the script that he didn't intend in the beginning. So when we see this add of the ha into Adam, we also see this with Abraham and Sarah. Before they were given the breath of God, they were known as Abram and Sarai. And the difference was the adding of the H, the ha, into their names in the Hebrew. So now it's Abraham and Sarah with an H. So that's the breath of like the Holy Spirit filling them, saying they're no longer this old name, they're now this name, because the ha is added into there. And we see this in Adam. So we have an Adam in Genesis 1 who was created, him and male and female, they created them out of the dust, and they're called Adam, or man. That's the general term for man back then. And then you have in Genesis 2:7 a Ha-Adam, one who has breathed life into his nostrils. So we're going to go and continue on to talk about this because I want to talk about the inconsistencies and where we can kind of gather that there was two separate creations. So this is the difference between the plus RH Adam and the RH negative Ha-Adam in this theory. So if you look at Adam and you look at Ha-Adam as two different things, when we read the scriptures, when it describes them, the inconsistencies go away, the plot holes go away, the contradictions disappear. And that's something that I've confronted and spoke with people who were atheist and agnostic that point these things out on a regular basis. But if it's two creations, it makes total sense. So if you look at Adam, the animals were created before man. On the fifth day and the fourth day, the different types of animals and beasts, of creatures of the earth were created before Adam even existed. But if you look at Ha-Adam, animals were created in front of Adam, and he was told to name each and every one of them. If you look at the next part, created both man and woman from the dust in the Adam story. But if you look at the Ha-Adam story, Adam was created first. God breathed the Ha into the man, and then he took Eve out of the man. Adam was told to be fruitful and multiply, but Eve wasn't created until after Adam, and they didn't need to reproduce because they had the tree of life. So it's interesting. And I think when we kind of skip over a lot of this with the creation of Adam and Eve. Adam was created first, and then Eve was taken out of Adam's ribs, which means they have shared genetics. They would have the exact same genetic lineage, which is interesting when we talk about the Rh negative, because two Rh negative parents have a higher likelihood of creating an Rh negative child. Now, if this is the beginning of the bloodline, the potency of this bloodline would almost assure an Rh negative child, because there is no other genetic lineage in that bloodline to tell it different. The Rh negative is predominantly a recessive gene, or a recessive part of the blood system, and the Rh positive is the dominant one. So if there's no Rh positive anywhere in the genetics to begin with, then the lineage, until it gets diluted with Rh positive, is going to be the only thing that's going to spring up through these children. So, but we'll go back to they did need to reproduce because of the tree of life. When you look at what Jesus was asked when the Pharisees and Sadducees came to him about whose wife would be who in heaven, and Jesus replies to them and says, well, we're going to have new bodies and we won't need to reproduce. So, and we don't need to have wives. So none of that even is relevant. Well, that's the same thing. We're going back to the bodies that we fell from in the garden. They didn't need to reproduce because they were eating from the tree of life. So one, Adam is told to be fruitful and multiply and populate the earth, while the other one is in this enclosed garden, that what we call Eden. And I believe you can picture it as kind of a nature preserve where everything was going on crazy outside of this Garden of Eden. But Adam and Eve were there with a bunch of animals and stuff, and they were tending and taking care of the land that was there, that God walked with them. The other thing to continue on is Ha'adam. They didn't consummate until after the fall. So one was told to be fruitful and multiply and procreate and repopulate the earth, while the other one didn't even get to that point until after the fall. Adam was told that all seeds of the earth are good for eating, and Ha'adam was told that they could eat from all the trees and all the fruit in the garden except for the tree of knowledge. So either we have a lot of consistency issues, or we have some plot holes that are going on here, or this is two creations of Adam. Now, there's a lot more that goes into this that I'm going to have to cover in other videos later on that kind of talk about this timeline. But for sake of time, we'll go ahead and skip forward a little bit. The next part, again, is about the lineage, the genealogies of the Bible. So we have Adam to Seth to Enos to Canaan to Mahalalel. Jared is when the fallen watchers we talked about in the last episode, when they came down. Enoch, the book of Enoch, is about Enoch and his writings and teachings. Methuselah and Lamech, when we talked about their parents, Noah's lineage. We get down to Noah, and we talk about the purity of Noah, that the reason why the rest of the world that was going on outside of the flood was happening was because of the genetic corruption of all of the people. It says that even the animals of the air and the birds of the birds of the air and the animals in the field, all flesh was tainted, except for one person. His name was Noah, and Noah's lineage was it's a Hebrew word that means pure or spotless, is used all throughout the Old Testament as the idea of what would be sacrificed, like a sacrificial lamb, it was without blemish, without spot. And that same word is used to describe Noah, just because of his genetics, because everybody else had intermingled their seed, but this line from Adam to Noah had not. Noah's an interesting character, though. When we get down to Noah, I found it's called the Book of Noah. It was in the Qumran caves, and it was attached to another script of Enoch, the Book of Enoch. And I thought this was really interesting because when we're talking about genetic diversity, when we talk about the out of Africa idea, was that everyone was African coming out of Africa, and then the genetic mutations over millions and millions and millions of years is what spawned us to have these, blue eyes and brown hair and red hair, that it spawned as genetic mutations from the original Cro-Magnon man. And I think what we're going to see in the biblical narrative is that the genetic diversity has always been there. And it's, part of the genetic diversity is talked about right here in this story in the book of Noah. It says, after some days, my son Methuselah took a wife for his son Lamech. Again, this is written and penned in the wording that Enoch is writing this text. I forgot to say that. But after some days, my son Methuselah took a wife for his son Lamech, and she became pregnant by him and bore a son. And his body was white as snow and red as the blooming of the rose. And the hair on his head was long locks. They were white as wool. and his eyes were beautiful. And when he opened his eyes, he lighted up the whole house with his sun, and the whole house was very bright. And whereupon he arose in the hands of his midwife and opened his mouth and conversed with the Lord of righteousness. And his father Lamech was afraid of him and fled, and came to his father Methuselah and said to him, I have begotten a strange son, diverse from and unlike man, and resembling the Son of God in heaven. So you see Lamech just kind of, see his son being born and pop out and be glowing and, white skin, and looks completely different from everybody else in his family line. And he runs out to his dad and says, Dad, I think my wife was sleeping with an angel. So he's freaking out at this point. But what I think is funny is that later on in the text is Methuselah ends up going on to Enoch, and Enoch tells him that this is a divine creation, that Enoch is meant to have his lineage the way that it is, and that he and his family are going to be on the other side of this great deluge that's coming. So, but it's funny though when you look at Lamech's reaction to this, saying that he doesn't look like anybody else in the family. What's going on here, right? So we see that, Lamech, and that they looked different than he did, but we can see this genetic diversity come through the other side. So as we keep going here, I did a little kind of funny diagram here with the little stick figure window stickers. That's a mouthful. And I kind of showed that this is how the genetic diversity could have worked. So you have Noah and Nama, who is a relative of Noah's, and their 3 sons and their wives. So let's, just hypothetically, if we looked at Noah and Nama, and they both were Rh negative, and they're so close to the genetic line, if God says that their line and lineage was pure, we're going to roll with that, right? So we're going to say they were both Rh negative. They have this direct lineage all the way up to Adam, and then they have children. Well, if both of them were Rh negative, then their children, that close and that potent of a bloodline to Adam, then their children would have been Rh negative as well. Until you introduce Rh positive into there, that's going to be the same Rh negative roll all the way down. So when we see that Shem, Ham, and Japheth, when they got their wives did not come from their family lineage. At least that's not what we're told. So the understanding is that they got their wives from the people on the other side of the flood. So the pre-flood people were where their lineage and their wives came from. So let's tag each one of them with Rh positive. Now, from the lineage of each one of those, they could have any number of combinations of Rh negative, Rh positive. But what I do think is really funny when we look at this situation is there are 8 people make it across to the other side of the flood, and we have 8 primary blood types that we study today. So, of course, there are more combinations, but the primary ones we look at are 8. Not that it's relative, but I just think it's interesting. So we talked about in our last video about the genetics of the Nephilim and how Ham and his mother had a child, and it was Canaan who was the patriarch of the Canaanites. And you can see how I believe God intended the genetics to flow a certain way, and when you went the opposite way of that, which we saw in Lot, and even I just was studying about Reuben the other day, where there was some issues there with Reuben and one of Jacob's concubines. So we kept seeing this happen over and over again, but we see Ham and Noah, his wife, having a child together, and it was Canaan. It's the uncovering of the nakedness we spoke about earlier. But you see how flowing the opposite way with this potent of a bloodline with an Rh negative son and an Rh negative mother causes giants. And we, like I said, we see this again with Lot and his 2 daughters creating the Moabites and the Amorites. So we get a little bit further and we move on to a time only a couple of hundred years later, once they come off the boat, and we have the gathering of all the people at Babylon. And then, of course, everything happens with the separation of the 70 groups of people scattered all over the world. And if you guys remember the video from Dr. Carter, where he talks about the dispersion of people from that point. That was in the first video, if you guys didn't get to see that. But from there, you could have, from 8 people to the time of Babylon, you could have had thousands of people, and those bloodlines intermingling. And remember, we said that the Rh positive is the dominant gene. So the more that those people intermarry, as they start producing and widening out, then the more dominant genes you're going to have, and you're going to start seeing where Rh negative, which was the recessive all the way down, is moving into a completely different, where it becomes the less of the two people groups. And I know that a lot of people are they're gonna look at this and they're gonna be curious as to how this started intermingling and whatever. But to look at this and say, to track this back and try to understand this, we're just now finally getting to that point in our genetics we're able to do this. And one of those examples is the Cherokee Indians, who are Rh negative. They have a pretty high group of Rh negative people in their genetic lineage, and they've been able to track them all the way back to northern Israel as one of the tribes of Israel. And I think as we start learning more about our genetics and learning more about our blood types, I mean, we're going to be able to see this. The 3 people groups we talked about in the first part of this, you can see on this top slide, they go to Spain in the Pyrenees Mountains. You can see this where people have just got on some boats and shot across there and went to Spain and hit that Pyrenees mountain range. You can also see where they kind of come around the coastal Africa, and then that's where the Canary Islands are. It could have very easily, from the time of Babylon, those people spread out and dispersed and traveled all over as the first dispersion. So, and they could have traveled all the way up and across the Bering Strait. They could have traveled all the way down to Australia, all during this time. And of course, this is talked about earlier in the first part of this episode. This was the first promise to Abraham. It says, when Abram was 90 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Then Abraham fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your offspring after you. That's Genesis 17:1-7. Then we get to Esau and Jacob, twins with genetic diversity. This is another interesting thing where we're talking about genetic diversity. And we say, oh, well, the Jewish people must have looked, like this back then. But when we actually go and look into it, we see so much genetic diversity in it. We just can't break out of the shell that, the Hebrew people look like they do today. And we're going to talk about that a lot as we go through this. But Esau, his name meant hairy or red. And both are very fitting for his description when you know that Jacob had to dress up and put goat skins on his arms so that he could trick his father into giving him his blessing. That's a hairy guy, and he was so, I've never seen a modern Jew today with bright red hair and that was covered from head to toe, probably looked like, Sasquatch or whatever. But so he was genetically diverse from his immediate twin. So that's interesting when we talk about the genetic diversity in this, that there are more color and shades of people than what we kind of look at today. And Jacob, his name meant plain or simple. In some translations meant he was a relatively perfect man. So his description, we don't get a full description of what he looked like, but to whatever the people looked like at the time, he was relatively perfect. He looked like most of the other people around him, but Esau definitely stood out. Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter with 3 women. The sons to note out of that are Judah and Joseph. And that actually brings up another crazy story that we can touch on a little bit later, but is Jacob's daughter, who is captured by a group of giants later on. And I think that ties in a lot with this as well. So this is the story of Tamar is a very interesting story, and I kind of condensed it down so we could hit it real fast. But I believe that Yahweh is really serious about his genetic line from Adam to the Messiah. That a lot of the things that we are taught and told, and the things that they were told not to do and not to be a part of, and not to run out and marry different tribes and different relationships, and not to do this, not to do that. I honestly, when I looked at all of this, I believe it was to protect the genetic line, to keep an infiltration from something else out of there. And when I look at Rh negative, it just to me seems like another factor to keep out this line from having an infiltration of something. But we'll talk about Tamar real quick. Tamar married Judah's eldest son who was wicked, and Yah killed him. That was basically it. Was wicked, and God killed him. And when we understand the genetics and genetic curses, we can understand why. There was something that God didn't want passed down from into Tamar's children. So God just said, you know what? I'm done with you. There's no need for you. You're not going to pass Judah's line down, and you're wicked. You're not going to throw those curses into this line. By the way of the Levirate union, Onan, who was brother, Tamar's brother-in-law, was to give her a child. So that law was basically set in place that if a father, the firstborn son, didn't have an heir to pass down the lineage, then the second-born son was supposed to go and basically take his sister-in-law and give her an heir under his father's lineage. So it wouldn't be Onan's child. It would have been heir. Onan was struck dead by Yah for spilling a seed and failing to follow the law. When I looked at this and understanding the description of the law and what it meant, and then also understanding what it was to have the birthright of the firstborn birthright. In this kind of story, Judah was supposed to give his first son away. If his first son had stayed alive, if hadn't died, then the blessing of the firstborn, the inheritance of the firstborn, would have went to but because died, Onan was faced with a choice here. If I give Tamar a son, then Tamar's son, male heir, becomes the direct lineage of which means that the inheritance would pass down through him. And what we saw with Onan I believe, was he was jealous and didn't want to give up what would have passed down to him if she had a son. Because if there was no heir down the firstborn's line, it gets passed down to the secondborn. So Onan was being greedy and wanted that inheritance from his father. So what he did was, he went forward with the act, and what it said is it's coitus interruptus is the Latin term. But he spilled his seed, and he didn't produce an heir for her, and he's immediately struck dead by God. And I look at that and I say, well, he had something in the genetics that God wanted to pass down through Judah's line, but he failed to be obedient, and God no longer needed him because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. So this is God being really serious about this. So it's an interesting, as it progresses, Judah had one more son. His name was Shelah, and he was the youngest of the three, but he was a boy at the time of all of this happening. Judah failed to give him up to Tamar. He said, wait a little while, and when he grows up, I'll give him to you. Well, when he grew up, Judah didn't end up giving him to Tamar. I think at that point he was probably a little bit terrified that Tamar was cursed or something, because he gave him his two oldest sons were under Tamar's care, and then all of a sudden they dropped dead. So he didn't want to give up his last son. But what Tamar does is, as she hears that after Judah's wife dies, he plans a trip to Timnath, and Tamar hears about this, and she rushes to Timnath, and she dresses like a temple prostitute. And Judah requests her services. I always some of these biblical stories, when you read them, when you kind of like actually are delving into them, you start going, what is going on here? So Judah's wife dies, and he makes like a Vegas trip to Timnath and grabs a prostitute and gets to this point. I just look at some of these stories, you're going, what is going on here? But the funny thing about it is, though, God's plan, regardless of what the best laid out plans of mice and men, God's plan still comes to fruition. But Judah doesn't have payment at the time, so he leaves his staff, his seal, his cord as security for the payment. So they have the consummate the act, and she's like, okay, where's my payment? He's supposed to pay her a goat, and he's like, well, I don't have a goat, I'll bring one back. So he leaves basically a security deposit with Tamar, and then he takes off. Judah goes back and tries to pay for the services with the goat, but he can't find the temple prostitute anywhere. She's gone. 3 months later, Tamar is accused of prostitution because of her pregnancy, and Judah orders her to be burnt to death. So at the time, she was still living as part of the extended family of the patriarch Judah. And so when she starts showing pregnancy, everybody's like, well, she hasn't had a husband, and the two guys that were supposed to sleep with her are dead. Where did she get pregnant from? So she whips out the proof that she has that Judah is the father, which was his staff, seal, and his cord, and says, the guy who's the father of this child, this stuff belongs to him. And, Judah probably was like, oh no, what have I gotten myself into? But so he grabs his stuff back from her and then basically releases her from her death sentence. Shortly after, Tamar has twins from this relationship with Judah, Perez and Zariah. It's interesting to note that Tamar didn't have any further relationships with Judah after that. So it's not like they carried on their relationship. What we really see here that's important is Perez, one of the two twins, is identified in the book of Ruth as the ancestor of King David. So what we see here, this entire story, the craziness of everything that happens in this story, was to get this child to be born. There was something about Tamar, because you have to look at this story and say, well, Judah, the line of David is supposed to come from the house of Judah, and the Messiah comes from David, and he's known as the Lion of Judah. But Judah had another son, Shelah. How come it couldn't have gone through that? What was going on with Tamar and needed to have Judah's seed? So what I think of what we're looking at here is genetics. If we're looking at Rh negative children, and this Rh negative factor plays in, if Tamar was Rh negative and Judah was Rh negative, and maybe Shelah wasn't, maybe that's why it didn't come down Shelah's line. But somebody, one of the sons that needed to have the Rh negative to pass it on was either or Onan. But because was wicked, didn't get the chance, and because Onan was disobedient, he didn't get the chance. So God says, okay, I've got Judah left. So he used the source of the Rh negative to go with Tamar so that they could create twins Rh negative, one of them being the line of King David. So this, when you throw the Rh negative in there, it fills the plot holes of this. So it's a very interesting story. And there's tons of these stories throughout the Bible. I wish I could hit them all, but. So we go down the line of Joseph to Moses. And that's a pretty interesting, of the two brothers. You have Judah and Joseph, which are the two kind of lines that we need to look at. Joseph becomes a vizier to the Pharaoh. He's reunited with his brothers and family. During the 7 years of famine, he calls his family to come into Egypt. It was 70 people started from the house of Judah to go live in Egypt. Several hundred years later, Moses leads 600,000 fighting men out of Egypt, which is estimated with women and children to be anywhere from 2.7 to 3 million in all. And some of these people were Egyptians, whom were counted as Hebrew, the scriptures say. So where do we get, the Jewish people or the Hebrew people coming through, and then some of the Egyptians too? Well, if we go all the way back to the dispersion at Babylon, those are the same genetic line of people that came from the other side, or from the other side of the flood. Remember, it says that all of the peoples of the world came down from those three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So God knows the genetics of these people, and some of those Egyptians were probably had the Rh negative bloodline that he was calling in, that he wanted those people to go with him. And that calling is part of what I wanted to talk about with the Rh negative. One of the interesting things about Moshe was the laws. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about a lot of the communities that get involved with the law and trying to go back and following the law is understanding that all 600 and some of the commandments are not all for everyone. And they're kind of broken down into about 4 categories. And you can kind of sub-break those down. Some of them we can do, some of them we can't. Some of them were meant and specifically say, for when you're in the land of Israel, you must do this. And then others are for everybody. They're covenants, which is a completely different thing. So like the 10 Commandments, which are direct commandments from Yahweh, those are the 10 Commandments. Those, there's no escaping. Those are for everyone. Those are an everlasting covenant to the Hebrew people, the people that are called by his name. The one that I really want to concentrate on is a couple that stood out is for the instructions of living. And that was kind of clean and unclean foods to eat, which wasn't just in Torah, but goes all the way back to Noah's flood, where they separated the animals from clean and unclean. So this was kind of something that was passed down for them, that was kind of, incorporated into the laws. But it was already known, and it was already something that God had already dictated to them separate from all of this. So it's not exactly something that Moses came up with. We saw this kind of appear throughout all the way up to the time of Noah. Not to eat animals with blood still in the meat. That was kind of an interesting one, because when you do that, you run the risk of parasites, bloodborne disease, infections, things like that. When we're talking about the genetics and protecting the bloodline of the Messiah, you start to understand when you look through the laws and why some of the things were being asked of them and what they should and shouldn't do. How to trim their hair and their beards, which I thought was interesting. It was when I was looking into the genetics of all this, realizing that the Greeks and the Romans would call everyone barbarians who didn't speak Greek or Roman. So we have this idea of barbarians like kind of looking like Nordic people and stuff, when it actually was anybody who didn't speak Greek or Roman. But that term actually has root words in barbar, which means bearded people. And so I find it interesting that there are some cultures and some people groups that can't grow beards at all. But there are some commandments on how to trim your hair and trim your beards, and all the depictions that we have historically and, the renditions and stuff like that have always shown Moses with a beard, Abraham with a beard, having this idea of having this bearded people group. But then we can associate that through time as where we get the term barbarian as a bearded people. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The circumcision is a big one, and I think a lot of people argue and debate over this. But I'm gonna propose a scenario of why circumcision was instituted in the first place. So when it was first given to Abraham as a covenant, Abraham was surrounded by these Ite people, the Rephaim, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites. All of these giant clans were around him, and he battled some of them in different wars, over and over and over again. He was battling him all the way back at his time. But we get on through these stories, and one of them was the 12 sons and the one daughter of the patriarchy of the 12 tribes. There was a story about how they had a tribe of giants had kidnapped one of the daughters and taken her away. And they sent, some people to say, hey, look, we got your daughter. The king of our giant group is super infatuated with her. We want you to can we broker some kind of deal so, we're not at war and battling or whatever. And so the brothers came together and they said, okay, here's what you do. We want all of your tribe of people to get circumcised. And when you do that, then you can come in and you can marry our daughters and our nieces and granddaughters and whatever. So the group of giants go off and they all get circumcised. And while they're agony and pain, laying in bed, trying to recover, the 12 brothers go in with a group of men and they go and slaughter all of the giants. that to me is one of those things. They could not have those guys being circumcised and infiltrating into the Hebrew people. And I believe this is an outward expression of an inward genetics. So if you can imagine the giants who grow into being 50 feet high or whatever, 18 feet high or whatever you can imagine them to, they didn't start out that way. They didn't grow. They're not born as giants. Much like a serpent or a snake, or even a liger in the instance of a lion and tiger mating together, they have a gene inside of their body that doesn't restrict their growth. So you and I, who are watching the show, we, for the most part, have a gene inside of us that tells us at 18 or 20 years old or whatever to stop growing. But whatever the genetic manipulation was that happened, that they came from that line, that genetic restriction was gone. So at 18 or 20 years old, they may still look like everybody else. So you can imagine a young Hebrew girl going to the riverbank and seeing this cute boy on the other side who's 18 or 20 years old. And, they start talking, and then they start frolicking in the hay. This was kind of one of those things that I believe God instituted, was a sign externally for this young maiden to realize that this boy was not from their lineage. There was something about him that she should not be with him. So you could be interested in the look of him and everything like that. But once you got down to brass tacks, when the business started happening, you knew what was going on as a female Hebrew or Israelite. So I think that this was one of those circumcision ideas, was another thing that was protecting the bloodline of Christ. I think we see this time and time and time again. They were commanded not to marry outside the people groups. And specifically, it says in Deuteronomy, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Those were the giant tribes that were around them at the time. So this is another commandment saying exactly kind of what we're saying. Do not let your daughters go out to them, and even your sons go out and marry their women. This happened time and time again. There were so many warnings from prophets about going out and committing adultery, and there's so many stories I could point out in this timeline and say this happened, and this happened. So this is just another one of those. King David's lineage. King David is recorded as having 7+ wives and many concubines, 19 sons and 1 daughter, with possibly many unaccounted for children from the concubines. King Solomon, King David's son, a successor, had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which included a Pharaoh's daughter, women of Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and of the Hittites. Remember what we just talked about before, about those women that they shouldn't have been involved in? Solomon had 4 notable children and possibly many unaccounted for children from concubines. So we see this going on here. Is an interesting thing that I would like to touch on for a minute. So in the Rh negative bloodline, a lot of people point at this as being the Nephilim bloodline because of how many elites in Hollywood and in the presidencies, all of these people, how many of them have and share the same bloodlines, that they have the same Rh negative. Well, remember back when we talked about Abraham's lineage, Abraham was promised kings out of that line, and that was a promise forever. So we have to remember that, because King David and King Solomon had a ton of children that went off out into the world. Those could be those same people that are ruling us today, those Rh negative people that we talk about, those Illuminati bloodlines. These are the same people that were promised down King David's line that they would be a lineage forever, but they're with pagan women, especially down Solomon's line. King Rehoboam, son of Solomon, and Naamah, an Amorite, succeeded his father after Yahweh told Solomon he broke covenant, and the breaking of the covenant was basically going out and sleeping with these foreign women, which ended up turning him to worshiping false gods. Later decisions from Rehoboam over taxation led to the revolt and separation of the northern 10 tribes and further dispersion of the Hebrew people, leaving only the tribe of Judah in the land of Israel. So remember the promises of Abraham. I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sands that is in the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemy, and your offspring shall be all of the nations of the earth, and they shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be blessed. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, the covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of multitude of nations. No longer shall you be name or your name be called Abraham, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout your generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your offspring after you. Look how many times it's offspring, nation, families. I mean, it's genetics, 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 genetics. And then we look at the term down here at the bottom, nations, in the Hebrew as goyim or goy, which is the same term that's used in the Greek, which is ethnos. And ethnos is the English root for ethnicity. So you can kind of insert in these, not just a nation, but a people group, an ethnicity, that he would be blessed with all of the ethnicities, all of the nations of the world are all coming down this exact same seed line. So we can't let the science tell us it's, we're so divided. We come from 3 different or 4 different Cro-Magnon this and, and out of Africa and all these different, theories of evolution, because the Bible doesn't say anything close to that. It says we come from these lineages through this genetic line. Let's see. And we have to remember Romans 11:29. It says the gifts and calling of God are without repentance. And this goes back to when God says he forms and fashions us in the womb. This is all part of this lineage. And he says that he is the one who puts the rulers into power. Well, he said from the beginning, down Abraham's line, kings will come out of you that will rule over you. This is an everlasting covenant, as well as I will be a God to your people as an everlasting covenant. That was an all-encompassing everlasting covenant. So the people that we subjugate ourselves to this day, I believe, is still the lineage of David, not some Nephilim serpent line. This is God saying that he fashioned and created all of this from the beginning, genetically knitted all of us together through our genetics, and that he has established all of these people, good, bad, and ugly. It says he gives his gifts and the calling are without repentance. So I know what we're going to get to this point. A lot of people are going to say, well, how is it that the same Illuminatic bloodline that's into adrenochrome and snatching up kids, that cannot be the line of Jesus. There's no way. I'm not going to believe that. It's not from the line of Jesus. Well, if we look at the Hebrew people all the way down that line, all the way back to the time when they were in the wilderness, they were worshiping, a bull god that basically, upset, God at that time. They were always into worshiping false deities throughout all the prophets. They were always coming out saying, why are you guys being adulterous? And you're going after other gods, and you're going after, the deities of these other lands. And you have an almighty God who has been with you. He's been chosen. This has not been the first time. You even have, I think it's Ezekiel that has the vision of underneath the temple where the priests at the time had their backs to the temple while worshiping a sun god. We see this time and time and time again of them worshiping these false deities. So why would that change today? God says there's nothing new under the sun. These same people who are these RH negative people are the same people that their ancestors were worshiping false gods. That's not surprising at all. But this may fill in some of the plot holes of how we are under these kingships and these people. Which kind of brings me up to something that was really interesting I wanted to throw in here. I don't know if everybody got to see this, but a couple years back when Obama was still president, there was a young girl who did the genealogy of all of the presidents and found out that all of them but one is related. So I'm going to play that real quick.
On the School Watch tonight, the story of a 7th grader from Salinas who claims to have made a major discovery about President Obama. She and her grandfather say that President Obama is related to all but one U.S. president. We get more tonight from Action News reporter Felix Cortez, who's live in our Salinas newsroom.
Well, Dan, the youngster spent the summer, really all summer, tracing the family tree of our presidents. Her conclusion that all the presidents, with the exception of one, share the same grandfather.
Well, first we start off with George Washington at the top, and then it goes to John Adams, Thomas Jefferson.
11-year-old Bridget Davigno says she's made a first-of-its-kind discovery that President Obama and all the presidents before him, with the exception of one, are related and descendants of a former king of England.
No, they are all cousins, and they're grandsons of John Lackland.
Davigno says she spent countless hours on the internet over the summer researching the lineage of our presidents, a project that started with her trying to trace her own family tree.
But I'm the first historian to do all the presidents.
Isn't that interesting that all of the presidents, except for one, were related to John Lackland, of the guy that signed the Magna Carta? So, I mean, you can see how the occult has been able to track their bloodlines. They've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. The kings of Europe, the presidents of the United States, the Illuminati bloodlines, they all know their genetics, and we don't. And it's probably more important to us than it is to them. So the cult, we know what they're doing. We know where they're trying to push this towards. We know they're trying to move towards. Revelation talks about genetic manipulation. You know, we have this whole understanding of the mark of the beast and all this. We know that's where they're moving towards. And I think that ties all into the genetics as well. But that's a story for another day. But in closing, what is it that we got from all of this? Well, we got Adam to the Messiah. And there's something about this Rh negative bloodline when I studied this that just shows the hypersensitivity to the spiritual realm. And I think we saw that in the paranormal studies of Rh negative, as well as some of the scientific and psychological studies that they recently just published some papers about paranoid schizophrenia and the relationship to Rh negative mothers and males. And when I've studied paranoid schizophrenia and actually went in depth to it, it goes hand in hand with hyper sensitivity to the spiritual realm. You can't deny that if you ever go in and study what psychosis is. So there's something there. I mean, this could be the reason why our prophets, our patriarchs were able to hear and walk with God, is because they had a hypersensitivity to the spiritual realm through this Rh bloodline. So I think it's very important. It was important to God over and over and over again in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it talks about genetics. It talks about the life being in the blood. All of this stuff was important to God, so it needs to be important to us. So I just really hope that, much like the flat earth movement, the understanding of the Nephilim, this leads people to start studying this more and get a better understanding and go back into the scriptures and look and try to apply a different lens to your studying and look how many times it says the genetics of this person, the birth of this person, the generations of this person, over and over and over again, because it's important. God doesn't do something and say something over and over again if it wasn't important. So that's about the most that I can get into on this. I had 3 hours worth of material for this, and I've had to cut it down to 2. So at some point, I'm going to have to release the full version of this with everything, because there was so much more entailed into this. But one of the important points to note is it doesn't matter about the hair color, the eye color, or even the blood type. There should be no division or looking at people in a racist manner or a suppressive manner or superiority, because at this point we're all tied together. When you look at the genetics of people through colonization, through the spread and migration of people, through dispersions, through Islam's jihad against the Western civilization for 1,300 years, it changes the whole people group. It changes the way they look. That's totally irrelevant at this point. The real promise is in our genetics, and the overall story of it is built into our genetics. It confirms the biblical narrative. It says we didn't come from millions and millions of years, that all the people groups came from 3 sons and their wives, and that all the genetic diversity is there in the Bible. So this whole idea that Jesus looked a certain way, or that people didn't fit in because they weren't a certain color group or whatever, that's all, it's all irrelevant. Because when you look at the genetics, you can see tons of different people groups that you wouldn't have expected, that maybe even they've hidden from us, that were all coming out of Mesopotamia, that all dispersed from the Promised Land, that from Babylon, from Egypt, those areas. And what they've tried to feed us about everything else is junk. It has nothing to do. It doesn't line up with the biblical narrative, and the biblical narrative lines up with genetics. So that's why it's so important. And it is important for one other set of reasons. What they're doing in the future is going to be based on genetics. Understanding our genetics, we need to start looking for correlations without knowing our blood types, without knowing our histories, our families' blood types and stuff like that. We're missing so much stuff. Everything from vaccine injuries to our diets, to future genetic changes, what they're going to do in the future, the way they're going to change, vaccines, all kinds of stuff. Abductions and trafficking and adrenochrome. This is all tied in to the bloodlines, and the world out there is all giving up all their information, their genetics. They're trying to find out, where they came from and what's this and what's that, but they're not looking. In the United States, we don't even know our blood type. And if it's important to God, it needs to be important to us. So I really hope this springboards more people to go out and look into this, because there's so much information here. I wish I could dump all this in this presentation. I just barely scratched the surface, because there's a ton more. But this is just 101, just to get you guys on board and to get you interested so you can start doing your own research. Go back into the scriptures, look for it, look for the genetics, and then follow it, because it's all there. Just want to thank Take on the World again. Thank Chris and Liz for having me on, and thank all the speakers who are going to be here. I appreciate you guys for watching, and get out there, prove me wrong. I don't know. This is just a theory. This was something that, I put together because it was interesting, and I found so many correlations. But get into your Bible and study more. And look at it from a generation's genetics point of view, and see what you can come up with. I want to see this grow and flourish. But thank you guys for watching the presentation. Enjoy the rest of Take on the World, and God bless.